If you live like a reality show and you govern like a reality show, you have to be prepared for your reality show staff to go full reality show on you. The Daily Beast now reporting the infamous former Apprentice star and White House aide Omarosa secretly recorded conversations with Trump while at the White House. Conversations she has, according to the report, played for people while pushing her own new tell-all book called, quote, Unhinged. This echoes a promise she did make the day after being ousted.
As the only African-American woman in this White House, as a senior staff and assistant to the president, I have seen things that have made me uncomfortable, that have upset me, that have affected me deeply and emotionally, that has affected my community and my people. And when I can tell my story, it is a profound story that I know the world will want to hear.
Everybody wants to hear this story, and she has been slowly teasing it out. She went on Celebrity Big Brother and described a kind of a haunted feeling in the White House.
Like, I was haunted by tweets every single day. Like, what is he going to tweet next? Like, it's bad. Should we be worried? Don't say that.
Should we be worried? Another question is, should we be whispering? Anyway, this isn't the first time we have heard about secret audio tapes. Michael Cohen famously taped the president. We've even heard some of those already leak.
You never know where that company, you never know where he's going to be.
Gets it, but
correct. So I'm all over that. And I spoke to Alan about it when it comes time for the financing, which will be.
Listen, what financing?
We'll have to pay you. So
No.
I got no.
Hey, Don, how are you?
This is a big scoop, and the person who wrote the scoop, Daily Beast, Lachlan Markey, is on the beat. Mike Lupica back with us as well. Lachlan, what do you see as the significance of this story?
Well, we spoke to three sources, one of whom has actually heard one of these recordings. Two of them have had the contents described to them. The way it was described to us, it's nothing quite so incriminating as the Michael Cohen recordings, but I think it does point to a major breach of trust by someone who is very close to the president, very close to the First Family, and really tells everyone that she meets about how much the president trusts her. And, the president did like her, and she was very close to that sort of inner circle of aides and family members. So for her to be secretly recording conversations with the president points to a major breakdown in trust. And now that she's marketing a book, suggests that she's sort of had her eye towards those post-White House plans for quite some time. Yeah, and another clear implication is that if you're recording the president, you're talking to the president, and that would appear to contradict the cover story they gave, which has been a familiar to many departing aides who the White House has tried to play down their actual role. Take a look.
Omarosa was fired 3 times on The Apprentice, and this was the 4th time we let her go. She had limited contact with the president while here. She has no contact now.
That word limited contact, as you know, most people who work in an administration have literally 0 conversations with the president. These tapes would suggest that she had more contact than the White House let on. Well, I do think she had less contact than she felt she was entitled to, given her long history with the president. And in fact, that's what really led to her downfall at the White House, was this scene where she, as it was described to us, stormed the White House residence in an attempt to confront the president about aides that she felt were undermining her and shutting her out. And there was a concerted effort by Chief of Staff John Kelly to really limit access to the president in the Oval Office. So I think she probably had a lot more access early on in the White House, saw that diminish. That really upset her, and it ended with her being escorted off the White House grounds for trying to literally confront and call out the president for that. Mike, you saw the important reporting that we garnered from Celebrity Big Brother in the introduction to the segment. And I want to play for you some earlier Omarosa, because it's not like any of this couldn't have been predicted when it goes to Donald Trump's judgment about who he wants to let in, run the government, be paid by our tax dollars, and have access to all sorts of private interactions. This is a person who has prided herself and Mr. Trump on settling scores. Take a look.
Every critic, every detractor will have to bow down to President Trump. It's everyone who's ever doubted Donald, whoever disagreed, whoever challenged him. It is the ultimate revenge to become the most powerful man in the universe.
To state the obvious, which is part of my job these days, Mike, being entrusted with the nuclear codes and leading the United States as an act of public service is not supposed to be chiefly thought of as a chance for personal revenge.
He sure can pick them, can't he? I mean, where does he find these people? He's obsessed with building a wall. He needs to build one around the Oval Office because, Ari, how far are we from people getting patted down before they go in and sit down across the desk from him?
Yeah. And so do you think there's something here, Mike, that's larger than Omarosa and all of the attendant drama and her book, her book promotion and the rest?
Yeah, I think he does. I think they don't trust him. And we constantly hear how the most important thing to this president is loyalty, okay? But you tell me where we can find it these days. Cohen, Omarosa, and I don't think these are the last times we're going to hear about people taping this guy. I think eventually there's going to be a conga line of people coming forward to say, no, listen to mine first.
Lachlan, how do you go about reporting something like this out and making sure that, as I've alluded to, and it applies to us as well, we're not just promoting her book? I mean, what do you think here is significant for the type of decisions Donald Trump has made? And also, when you go into this, what has been described by others and even a lot of serious people as a really tense environment in the White House where everyone is lawyered up and worried about tapes, we still have a government that needs to be staffed and run. Do you see an implication here for the quality and the type of people who are brought into this White House?
Well, I think from the very beginning, there's been a sense of sort of a lack of solidarity, whether it was between the various sort of camps that split into opposing factions from very early on, to folks sort of accusing each other of leaking as a way of settling personal scores or getting in the president's good graces. And in fact, we got an advance copy of an excerpt of Omarosa's book in which she recalls basically assembling a list of alleged leakers at Ivanka Trump's request that then communications director Anthony Scaramucci would then be tasked with going out and firing. One of them actually was fired, but I think sort of the larger narrative in that excerpt and also of this larger story of Omarosa recording these conversations is just a total lack of trust between the people who work in the White House. And it's very difficult to form coherent policy or coherent messaging when nobody trusts each other, all the way up to the president and his tightest inner circle of aides.
Yeah, I think that's well put. And again, that goes to who's in charge and their obsession with leaks in media. And granted, we are part of the Fourth Estate and covering things, but their obsession with it above and apart from all other obligations as a federal employee and a White House staffer is really notable. And it comes on a day when the other folks, the lawyers, are doing their own radio tour instead of their work. It's a remarkable situation that shouldn't be completely normalized, even though it is a daily thing. Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.